Welcome to timeless love stories that live beyond the ages. If you were given the choice to risk everything for one soul, even as kingdoms fall, would you take their hand or turn away into the silence? The River Nile, old as time itself, flowed slow and silver beneath the desert moon. Its waters carried centuries of song and sorrow, of lovers crowned and buried, of queens who rose like stars and vanished like them too. And in this moment, beneath the velvet hush of a foreign night, it whispered her name, Cleopatra. She stood alone upon her palace terrace, the hem of her linen gown brushing ancient marble worn smooth by the feet of the Ptolemies. Her eyes, lined in kohl and shadowed by memory, gazed east toward the open sea. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a Roman vessel was cutting through the water, swift and fated. A general approached not just any, but Mark Antony, beloved of Rome, second only to Caesar, commander of legions, maker of kings. And she, last daughter of the Nile, had summoned him. The court whispered of war, of politics, of gold-laden treaties and a queen's clever machinations. But beneath it all, Cleopatra was playing another game, one not just of state, but of fate. She had loved once, long ago, in the shadow of another Roman Julius Caesar, whose death had shattered the sky like thunder in her youth. Now Antony came to her not as conqueror, but as equal. And perhaps, in some secret place inside her heart, she hoped he came as something more. She turned from the sea, her earrings catching starlight. Down below, in the palace courtyards, preparations had begun. Musicians tuned their lyres with trembling hands. Incense drifted from altars where offerings were left to Isis and Hathor, goddesses of love, power and divine womanhood. Cleopatra did not simply wish to impress, she needed to dazzle, to enchant, to make Antony forget Rome's cold marble and feel Egypt's burning sun in her presence. History had taught her the world was built for men who carried swords. For women, love was war. In Tarsus, where the meeting would take place, she would not arrive as a supplicant. She would arrive as a goddess on a barge, golden sails blooming above her like the wings of Horus, her skin perfumed with myrrh, and her attendants dressed as nymphs of the Nile. It was not vanity, it was strategy, it was myth, woven into flesh. And yet, standing in the hush of her garden, she was not queen nor goddess, not seductress nor stateswoman. She was simply a woman young, tired, brilliant, afraid. She thought of her children sleeping under embroidered canopies, of the weight of Egypt pressed upon her shoulders like desert heat, of how close the edge always felt, how narrow the balance between being remembered and being erased. Cleopatra was not beautiful in the way of statues. She was beautiful like a storm, unpredictable, glittering, alive. Her voice could soothe or sting. Her words were blades dressed in poetry. And as the night deepened around her, she began to compose the verses of her next great performance. Elsewhere, in the vast halls of Rome, Mark Antony prepared in his own way. He was no longer the idealistic young man who had once fought beside Caesar. He bore the lines of command, the smell of iron and dust. He was impulsive, magnetic, carved by war and crowned by victory. But there were rumours that he drank too deeply, that he laughed too loudly, that Rome, with its marble expectations, no longer knew what to do with a man who loved too freely. It had been said that Caesar conquered the world, but Cleopatra had conquered Caesar. What then would she do to Antony? The desert wind stirred the reeds outside Cleopatra's chamber. She closed her eyes. Soon, their names would be spoken together in the courts of history, whispered in the lips of poets and the hands of playwrights. But not yet, not tonight. Tonight, everything was still possible. Would he see her as Rome saw her, an enchantress, a temptress, a threat, or would he see her as she longed to be seen, a woman who loved fiercely, a mother, a sovereign with the weight of centuries at her feet, a soul, solitary and sovereign, waiting in the half-light for the one man who might meet her not with suspicion, but with understanding. The moon hung low, glowing like a pearl against black silk. The ships approached, and in the stillness before fate arrived, the world held its breath. Because when love walks toward you draped in armour and shadows, when kingdoms tremble beneath a single glance, what part of you dares to believe that this, at last, could be the beginning? The wind off the sea carried the scent of salt jasmine, and something older, something like memory. When Mark Antony arrived in Tarsus, the city was already brimming with anticipation. Roman soldiers murmured in half awe, half mockery. Merchants from Syria and Phoenicia lingered in alleyways, hoping to catch a glimpse, but none truly knew what they were waiting for until they saw it a barge sailing up the Cydnus River, unlike any vessel that had ever graced Roman waters. It shimmered like a dream, a floating palace trimmed in gold, with purple sails that billowed like the wings of phoenixes, silver oars dipped in rhythmic unison, their movements so synchronized that the river seemed to breathe with them. Upon the deck, beneath a canopy embroidered with stars, lay Cleopatra. She did not rise. She reclined as though time itself served her, her body draped in robes of sheer white and Nile green, her arms adorned with cuffs of lapis and gold. Around her, attendants played flutes and scattered rose petals across the water. The people lining the banks fell into hushed silence, not from reverence, but wonder. It was not a queen they saw, but the embodiment of a myth. She had become Aphrodite arriving on the tide. Antony stood on the stone quay, arms folded, flanked by Roman officers in iron breastplates. At first he did not move. He watched as the barge drifted closer, as the perfume of Egypt wafted over the water and settled around him like smoke. His eyes narrowed not with suspicion, but with something far more dangerous intrigue. He had expected politics, a negotiation, a monarch in formal dress with guarded words. He had not expected poetry. Cleopatra finally rose. She descended the barge as one born to ceremony, every step deliberate, every breath a gesture. When she reached the shore, she did not bow, she did not curtsy, she simply held Antony's gaze, long enough for the world to vanish behind it. "Rome has sent a god," she said softly, "and Egypt has come to meet him." Her voice was low, warm, like honey poured in the dark. Antony, for a moment, forgot his titles. He forgot his war. He only saw her eyes dark, lined with coal, impossibly calm, and something beneath them that neither Rome nor Alexandria could name. The formal greetings were extended, but they mattered little. Their meeting was not born of language, it was born of presence. Cleopatra invited Antony to feast that evening on her barge. He accepted without hesitation. As dusk fell, the river glowed with 1,000 oil lamps. The barge became a world unto itself, cushioned in silks, heavy with incense, the air thick with citrus and smoke. Wine flowed in cups of carved onyx. Musicians played songs older than the pyramids. Dancers moved like reeds in water. And at the centre of it all, Cleopatra and Mark Antony. They spoke in riddles and laughter, in fragments of Greek and Egyptian and Latin, in flirtation sharpened like blades. She teased his Roman pride. He challenged her Egyptian mystique. They traded stories, his of campaigns and triumphs, hers of temples and dreams, but underneath it all was an unspoken question. Had they met too late or just in time? Cleopatra watched him not as Rome did, with fear or calculation, but with curiosity. Here was a man who had lost and won 1,000 battles, yet laughed like a boy chasing storms, a man who drank like Dionysus and wept in private for fallen comrades. She saw the cracks behind the marble and did not flinch. Antony, in turn, saw a woman who was more than a queen, not merely beautiful, but luminous, intelligent in ways that unsettled men who mistook her gender for gentleness. Here was no docile consort, but a woman who could quote Homer and issue naval commands in the same breath. The night deepened. The river hummed beneath them. The stars above were reflected in Cleopatra's eyes, or perhaps it only seemed that way. Antony leaned closer, his hand grazing hers beneath the table. She did not pull away. Their fingers remained intertwined, not boldly, but quietly, like a promise still unspoken. In that suspended moment, the world receded. They were no longer Rome and Egypt, conqueror and sovereign, lion and sphinx. They were two people, tired of war and glory, searching for something gentler beneath the noise. And as the moon rippled across the river, neither of them said what they felt. They did not need to. It hung between them, trembling like a drop of wine on the edge of a goblet, waiting to fall. Later, as the feast ended and the barge docked in silence, Antony turned to look back at her once more before stepping ashore. Cleopatra stood framed in torchlight, her face unreadable, her silhouette motionless. She did not call out. He did not return. But something had shifted, something irreversible. The lines between duty and desire had blurred, and the gods, if they still watched, said nothing. What had begun as diplomacy had become something else entirely, and the river, ancient and eternal, carried their silence into the night. In Alexandria, nights breathed differently. The air was scented with citrus groves and myrrh, thick with the salt of the sea and the sweet decay of lotus flowers. Here, under the twin gaze of the moon and the library's flame, knowledge and passion wove together, indistinguishable. It was a city built not just on stone and sand, but on longing for immortality, for beauty, for love that outlasts dynasties. This was the world Cleopatra brought Mark Antony into. He arrived not as a Roman general, but as something far less armoured. Her guest, her companion, her fascination. The banquets were frequent, yet never the same. One evening, they dined by candlelight in the royal observatory, the stars mirrored in polished bronze instruments as philosophers recited verses of Sappho. Another night, they laughed on a barge drifting through canals lined with papyrus torches, music trailing them like perfume on water. It was not decadence for its own sake. It was ritual, a seduction of the senses, yes, but also of the soul. Antony, accustomed to the harsh discipline of Roman courts and the cold pride of marble temples, found himself disarmed by the softness of Alexandria. Here, love was not confined to corners or whispered behind tapestries. It was danced, sung, etched into walls, blessed by the gods. And Cleopatra, ever the weaver of symbols, gave Antony a space to forget who he was supposed to be. By day, they walked the palace gardens, her hand grazing olive branches, his voice warming to stories of his youth, his mother's stern mouth, his first sword, the way Caesar had once placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You were made for greatness, boy. Don't let Rome make you small." He confessed these things lightly, as if they did not ache, but Cleopatra heard the tremble between the words. By night, their intimacy grew quieter, more fragile. Sometimes they did not speak. They would lie beside one another, shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the moon through gauze-covered windows. In those hours, silence became sacred. In public, they remained distant. Cleopatra knew eyes followed them, tongues already whispered in Rome, but in private, she allowed herself to look at him not as a strategy, not as a shield, but as a man who made her laugh, a man who sometimes stared into the sea for too long, lost in something he would not name. Antony, in turn, found himself undone. There was a gentleness in her that the world had refused to see, a gentleness forged in survival, not in surrender. He saw it when she cradled a dove fallen from its nest, when she kissed her son Caesarion's forehead before bed, when she lingered too long by the statue of her father, whispering words in Greek too soft to catch. And there were moments, rare, but searing, when he touched her cheek and she closed her eyes not out of pleasure, but out of something deeper, something like recognition, as if some forgotten part of her had waited years for this hand, this breath, this moment. They began to invent their own language, a gesture, a glance, a phrase passed like a coin beneath the table. The sun is warm today, which meant, I thought of you this morning, or the garden sleeps, which meant, let us go where no one can see us. The court noticed. Whispers circled like hawks overhead. Roman envoys sent back messages thick with alarm. He has been bewitched, they wrote, his sword dulled by her perfume. But it was not magic. It was two wounded souls finding the rarest thing in all the world understanding. Still, Cleopatra knew better than to trust the stillness. History never allowed lovers to linger in peace. Time was not their friend, it was a shadow at the edge of the feast, a footstep outside the door, and yet she chose to stay in the moment, to believe in this fragile miracle. One morning, as dawn poured like honey over the palace, Antony stood by her bed, watching her sleep. Her hair spilled over silk pillows, dark as river reeds, her breathing steady. He did not touch her. He simply watched, and something inside him shifted, something ancient and painful. The way a man remembers all at once or what he has always wanted. He whispered her name. She stirred, opened her eyes, and reached for his hand without speaking. That day he postponed his departure again. The war could wait. Rome could wait. What could not wait? What would not wait was the quiet joy of her smile in the morning, the way her lips curved before she spoke, the simple miracle of her presence. In the stillness between duty and desire, they chose desire, not because it was easy, but because it was the only thing that felt true. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, two hearts beat out a rhythm not of nations or conquest, but of something infinitely softer, a rhythm that said, I see you, I know you, I am yours. It was autumn in Alexandria. The heat softened its grip, and the nights grew long with indigo shadows and the murmuring of the sea in the gardens of the palace. Pomegranates hung heavy on the branches, their red skins splitting slightly, eating seeds like garnets onto the white stone paths. Antony no longer counted the days. He'd been in Egypt for weeks, then months, and the Roman world began to blur. Messages from Rome arrived, but remained unread in piles of sealed scrolls. Officers waited for orders, allies sent warnings. Even Octavian, Caesar's heir, wrote with a voice sharpened by concern and ambition. But Antony had ceased listening to anything that spoke in the tongue of politics. He had learned a new language, one written in warmth and eyes that linger, one spoken in the soft hush of Cleopatra's breath beside him when she shuddered. In the silence between their public lives and private hours, they became something unspoken. They were no longer only lovers, they were mirror and echo. They were two pillars holding up a ream of Aehaenates between empires. Yet the world was watching. Cleopatra had always known it would. At council meetings, the tension sharpened, Roman advisors grew restless. Egyptian nobles exchanged glances too quickly, and in Rome, senators hissed behind veils of civility, Antony is lost. Antony is hers. Antony forgets Rome. But Antony remembered more than they knew. He remembered what it's meant to feel whole. With Cleopatra, he did not have to perform greatness. He did not need to prove strength. He could be the boy who had once dreamed of Greece, who recited Homer beneath fig trees, who wanted not conquest, but legacy, something to leave behind that wasn't carved in blood. Sometimes they would speak of it in the quiet hours just before sunrise, when the wind moved through the palace like a sigh. "What will they say of us?" Cleopatra once asked, her voice no louder than the rustle of linen sheets. "That we were foolish," Antony said, "that we loved too much and ruled too little." She smiled. "Perhaps they will say we were gods." "Gods are not remembered kindly," he said. "Nor are cowards." And then he kissed her gently, with the reverence of a man who knows there is more behind a woman's crown than ambition. There was grief and hope and centuries of history folded into a single breath. Still, she felt the shift before he did. It began subtly an increase in Roman ships along the Mediterranean coast, questions from Roman provinces about taxes, loyalty, alliance. Octavian had not been idle, with each letter ignored, with each rumour that Antony had fathered twins with the Egyptian queen. The line between statecraft and vengeance blurred. And Antony, he remained in Alexandria. It was a kind of peace, but one carved from denial. He trained with Egyptian soldiers at dawn. He listened to scholars read Virgil in the library courtyard. He laughed more. He wept sometimes, too. And Cleopatra watched all of it. The man he was becoming, the man he might have been if fate had not carved him into a monument too early. In a small sun-drenched room overlooking the harbour, they began planning festivals, the celebration of Isis, the renewal of harvest rites. They paraded through the city in golden chariots, their children behind them, garlanded and waving to crowds. Antony wore Egyptian robes for the first time, not in mockery, but with quiet pride. He stood beside Cleopatra not as her conqueror, not as her consort, but as her equal. They declared themselves rulers of East and West. To Rome, it was treason. To Alexandria, it was prophecy. On a warm evening, as lanterns swung gently from date palms, Cleopatra held a falcon on her arm. She looked at the bird not for its beauty, but for what it symbolized. Horus, the sky, vision. "What do you see?" Antony asked her. She did not answer right away. The bird beat its wings softly, eyes sharp, tethered only by a silken thread. "I see the world," she said at last, "and I see how it will undo us." Antony stepped beside her, then let it. But there was sadness in her face, a sorrow that belonged not to her, but to every woman who had ever loved a man fated to belong to war. "I don't want a monument," she whispered. He looked at her, eyes steady. "Then what do you want?" She turned, touched the corner of his mouth with her fingers. Only a story, one they whisper in candlelight, one where they say, she was not his ruin, she was his reason. Antony did not answer with words. He pulled her into his arms, held her until the stars blinked into view one by one, as though the gods themselves were watching, still unsure whether to bless them or let them fall. The waters between Egypt and Rome grew dark. Autumn bled into winter, and winter passed with uneasy quiet, but the stillness was not peace. It was the hush before thunder. Word reached Alexandria Antony's brother had died. His wife, Fulvia, once a cunning political partner, had died as well, and Octavian, the ever-patient architect of Rome's future, was consolidating power with quiet, brutal efficiency. Cleopatra received the news with narrowed eyes, as if reading a riddle behind the message. "You must return," she told Antony one morning as they stood on a terrace overlooking the sea. The light was soft, the waves calm, but there was a tightness in her voice that no music could soften. "To Rome?" he asked, the words dry in his mouth. She nodded. "For now, not forever." He looked at her, saw the strength beneath the sadness, and realized that love, if it wished to survive, must sometimes let go. And so he went. Not as a man fleeing a kingdom of pleasure, nor as one repenting love. He went because Rome demanded him, because Octavian had begun to whisper of betrayal, because legions had begun to ask, "Where is Antony?" The separation was swift. There was no farewell on the pier, no public grief. They had made a vow in silence to endure. But Cleopatra stood in the highest chamber of the palace that night, gazing across the black waters, and her fingers trembled. She knew the world would seize him in its cold marble hands again. She knew Rome would press him back into iron, strip him of linen and perfume, remind him of laws, duties, empires. She whispered a prayer to Isis, to the Nile, to whatever gods had not yet turned away. Antony's return to Rome was met with ceremony. He was still one of the triumvirs, still respected, still feared, but he was different now. There was Egypt in his silence. There was softness in his gaze. There was perfume on his cloak that no Roman incense could wash away. He met with Octavian. They clasped arms, smiled, ate together, spoke of treaties and enemies, but beneath it all, the air was cold. Octavian watched him as one watches a man no longer loyal to the temple. Not a soldier, not a brother, a rival. In a show of reconciliation, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia, a woman graceful and dutiful, kind even, but not Cleopatra. Antony did what was required of him. He walked the Senate halls again, he wore the iron of Roman command. He paraded through streets that once sang his name. But at night, in the solitude of his chambers, he held a golden coin stamped with Cleopatra's profile, the curve of her cheek, the sharp intelligence in the eyes carved into metal. He would close his eyes and feel the shape of her name in his breath. And Cleopatra. She waited. Not as a woman abandoned, but as a queen whose gaze never left the western horizon. In the quiet months, she ruled, she raised her children, she oversaw irrigation projects and minted new silver coinage. She made offerings to the gods, not for victory but for patience. Still, Alexandria felt hollow without him. The banquets became fewer, the laughter more strained. In her private chambers, she would pace at night, her bare feet silent on cool mosaic tiles, her heart pacing with her. When messages finally arrived, they were brief, formal, but coded in them were signs only she would read. "The weather in Rome is cold," one began, which meant, "I miss your warmth." Another said, "Your ships are stronger than we thought," which meant, "I have not forgotten you." Then silence. For months, Cleopatra's courtiers grew anxious. Rome was stirring, Octavian was growing bold. There were whispers that Antony was slipping from her fingers. But she refused to panic. She remembered his voice when he held her. She remembered the weight of him beside her in sleep, the way he traced constellations on her skin and spoke of empires not yet built. She remembered that their story was not finished. Then, suddenly, the silence broke. A lone ship arrived in Alexandria's harbour under Roman colours. At its helm, Antony. He returned not with ceremony, but with urgency. He arrived with eyes lined by war and months of self-restraint cracking around the edges. And when he stepped into the palace garden, she was already waiting, her hair braided with pearls, her face unreadable. He did not speak. He simply knelt before her not as a servant, not as a general, but as a man who had spent too long away from the only place that had ever felt like home. "Rome is no longer mine," he said. She lifted his chin, looked into his eyes. "Then what is?" He stood, took her hands in his, "Only this, only you." And just like that, the tide turned. No longer was Antony torn between worlds. He had chosen, and with that choice came consequence. Together, they began again, not in secrecy, but in defiance. Rome would call it treason. But in Alexandria it was love reclaiming its throne. The city of Alexandria, once hushed in waiting, now awoke with fire. Mark Antony's return to Egypt was not quiet, not diplomatic, not concealed behind veils or modest intention. It was thunder. It was a torch in the dark, a declaration that shook the halls of power from the Euphrates to the Tiber. He had chosen not just Cleopatra, but a path, a vision, a future that would never bow to Rome's stern geometry. At his side, Cleopatra stood not as a mistress or ornament, but as a sovereign. They wore their crowns together, held court together, ruled together, and together they set the world ablaze. In the grand halls of the palace, where papyrus rustled in the breeze and gold-leafed columns shimmered under the desert sun, they held ceremonies that redefined empire. Antony declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings, and in a moment that echoed through time, she named their children rulers of distant lands, lands yet unconquered, claimed in prophecy and bloodline. To Egypt, it was glory. To Rome, it was treason. The Senate seethed. Octavian watched with cold fury as Antony slipped beyond his grasp. The alliance was broken. The marriage to Octavia betrayed. Roman dignity insulted. Cleopatra was no longer just a queen, she was Rome's most vivid threat. And Antony, once beloved, now stood painted and in scandal. Letters arrived in Alexandria, venomous with Roman pride. They accused Antony of abandoning his people, of poisoning himself with Eastern luxury, of being enslaved by a woman. But Antony did not answer. He wore his Egyptian robes without shame. He rode beside Cleopatra in chariots, hand in hand, with music rising around them like the chant of gods. Their love had become a banner, and with it came war. Octavian moved swiftly. He summoned the Senate, gave fiery speeches to the Roman people, painting Antony as lost, bewitched, no longer Roman in soul or in sword or. He played on fears of foreign queens and Eastern gold, on Roman disdain for softness, for sensuality, for anything that did not bleed stone. Antony was declared an enemy of the state, and so the lovers prepared. They gathered ships in the harbours of Alexandria, great vessels carved with lion heads, sails dyed crimson and indigo. From the coasts of Phoenicia and the deserts of Arabia came warriors loyal not to Rome, but to the banner of Cleopatra's lineage and Antony's legacy. Each night, beneath the palm shadows and star-flecked skies, they trained together, man and woman, general and queen. She rode beside him on horseback, her linen garments flowing behind her, hair braided with iron wire. She had not forgotten how to rule, how to fight, and he had not forgotten how to love a woman who refused to kneel. They did not speak of fear, but it moved beneath everything. Cleopatra's children, still young, watched with wide eyes as the palace shifted into a war machine. Antony's oldest legates grew greyer by the day, and yet there was resolve, there was clarity. On one evening, with the harbour flickering under torchlight, Antony stood atop the Tower of Pharos. Cleopatra joined him, silent as the wind. "What if we lose?" he asked, his voice low. She did not look at him, then let the world say we tried to build something beyond Lorpo Clondit. He turned to her, "And if we win?" Her eyes met his, then let them tremble before a love stronger than empire. They kissed there, beneath the stars, no longer as man and woman alone, but as symbols too large to hide. Their union was no longer personal, it was myth in the making, and that, perhaps, was the tragedy. In war, love is never untouched. Rome's armies amassed. Octavian moved east, careful, calculating, wrapping his forces in order and tradition. His war was not just military, it was ideological. Against indulgence, against betrayal, against Cleopatra. Against a world in which love and power might coexist. At Actium, the two forces met. The sea stretched wide and waiting, dotted with sails and sharpened shadows. The lovers led their fleet not from behind, but side by side. Antony commanded from the warship Athenon, his banner of silver and fire whipping in the salt wind. Cleopatra's vessel gleamed with Egyptian gold, her prow carved into the face of a falcon, her eyes steady, unreadable. The wind shifted. The sky dimmed with smoke. The battle began. It would become a day written in blood, a day when gods looked away. The waters of Actium churned with fire and fear. At dawn, the Ionian Sea had been quiet, its surface smooth and silver, reflecting a sky still soft with the breath of morning. But by midday, it had become a mirror of chaos, blades glinting, ships screaming against wind and tide, banners torn and swallowed by smoke. Cleopatra stood on the deck of her flagship, robed in white linen veined with gold thread. Her hair was pinned high, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the silhouettes of Roman ships closed in like jaws. Around her, the air rang with orders and the hiss of burning oil, the cries of men who believed, some in victory, others in a death worth choosing. Antony's warship was only a breath away, sails straining in the wind, oars cutting the sea like teeth. He moved with the urgency, not desperation, his voice steady as he directed the Eastern fleet, but in his eyes there was something quieter, a question, a fear not for Rome, nor for himself, but for her. They had gambled everything, and Octavian knew it. His navy, leaner and faster, took advantage of the wind, outmaneuvering the grand, ornate Egyptian ships. Where Antony's vessels relied on power and grandeur, Octavian's cut through the sea like knives, bit by bit. The Eastern fleet faltered not from cowardice, but from exhaustion, from distance, from time running out. Cleopatra saw it first. The turning of the tide. The Roman right flank slipping past their defences, the fires igniting in the lower decks, the war drums beating from Octavian's command ship like a pulse counting down the moment everything would break. She did not wait. With a sharp command, her flagship turned, sails pulled tight, heading for the open sea. It was not betrayal. It was survival. It was the moment upon which 1,000 historians would later build myths that she fled in fear, that she abandoned him. But no one saw the way she hesitated at the helm, eyes locked on Antony's ship. No one heard her whisper his name into the salt wind, her knuckles white on the railing. No one recorded the way her heart broke in the space of a single breath, when the war became larger than love. And Antony, he saw her ship move. He saw the royal sails vanish behind a wall of smoke and wind. In that instant, he could have stayed, could have fought until death or triumph, but something deeper pulled at him, not honour, not duty. He turned his vessel, broke from formation, and followed. His men shouted in protest, his generals begged him to stay. But he heard only silence, the silence of her absence. And so the Eastern fleet crumbled. Without its commanders, the formation scattered, fire caught the masts, Roman archers rained iron into the sea, ship after ship fell not for lack of courage, but for the absence of their heart. By nightfall, the battle was over. Octavian did not cheer, he did not even smile. He had won, but not yet broken them. Far from the smoke and ruin, Antony reached Cleopatra's ship. They met not with fury, but with silence. She stood at the edge of the deck, her shoulders drawn tight, her jaw trembling though no tears fell. He approached slowly, his armour scorched, his hands burned. "I thought I had lost you," he said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You did." But then she turned, took his hand, pressed her forehead to his chest, and let the silence speak for what words could no longer bear. In the dim lantern light of her cabin, he touched her not as a soldier, but as a man undone. She clung to him not as a queen, but as a woman holding the last thing in the world that still felt real. Outside, the sea groaned. Inside, they made no promises, only held each other in the dark, knowing the gods had turned their faces away. From the shores of Rome to the sands of Egypt, the tide carried news of the defeat. Whispers turned to roars. The world shifted. They had risked everything. And lost. But in that loss, there was something unbreakable. In the eyes of Rome, they were ruined. In the eyes of legend, they had become eternal. Alexandria awaited them in mourning. The fleet had not returned as conquerors, nor as heroes cloaked in Roman crimson and Egyptian gold. It returned in fragments, burnt sails, broken oars, whispers of loss carried by sea wind. The people did not cheer. The palace did not light its torches. The sky above the harbour was the colour of bruised glass, as though the city itself had entered a long, breathless pause. Antony walked through the palace gardens like a man trapped between past and shadow. His armour lay untouched, his hands once calloused by swords and reins, now trembled when he gripped the marble balustrade overlooking the sea. Every morning, he watched for sails that would never come, for soldiers who had died beneath banners meant for triumph. He did not speak of Actium. He did not speak at all. Cleopatra, too, moved like a ghost through corridors she had once ruled with fire. The perfume of jasmine and myrrh no longer lingered in the air. The musicians did not play. The pools reflected empty skies. There were days she did not rise, days when her ladies found her curled beneath silken sheets, eyes open, unblinking. She was not broken, but she was unravelling. Thread by golden thread, Egypt was still hers, but no longer whole. The children noticed. Caesarion, still young but no longer blind to sorrow, followed her with questions he did not speak aloud. The twins asked why Antony no longer laughed, why the Hall of Lions was quiet, why the gods no longer danced in their festivals. Cleopatra kissed their foreheads and whispered stories of Osiris and Isis, of storms and rebirth, but even her voice, so steady, wavered now at the edges. Rumours of May arrived before the messengers did. Octavian was coming. He had taken Greece, secured the loyalty of provinces, painted the lovers as enemies of the Roman people. Every scroll that reached Alexandria burned colder than the last, and the final message delivered in silence by a trembling envoy confirmed what they had long feared. Octavian's fleet was sailing toward Egypt. Antony gathered what remained of his forces. He trained with a desperation that did not speak of victory, but of delay. He stood in dusty courtyards with his legates, spoke of fortifications, of walls and defence lines, but his voice cracked. His hands bled through the wrappings of his training gloves. He did not sleep. Cleopatra, behind the curtains of the palace, began her final dance of diplomacy. She sent letters, promises, gold, a final attempt to protect what could still be saved her children, her people, perhaps even Antony. But the truth hung heavy in the halls. No army could turn back Octavian now. Not this time. In the garden where they once drank wine beneath fig trees and whispered verses into each other's hair, Cleopatra met Antony one night beneath a flickering torch. He looked older now, not in years, but in soul. His skin was weathered with sorrow. His eyes had turned inward. "I can still fight," he said. She stepped closer, but for what? He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. Cleopatra placed a hand on his chest, where his heartbeat thudded beneath bone and regret. "You have already given everything." He looked away, and yet it was not enough. She leaned into him, their foreheads meeting, breath shared between grief. It was never about enough. It was about being. You were mine, I was yours. That was everything. They stood like that as the wind moved through the acacia trees, rustling dry leaves like ancient prayers. In the final days, the palace transformed again, not into a fortress, but into a tomb of beauty. The halls were perfumed, the fountains cleaned, the statues polished, the walls were draped in royal colours, lapis, crimson, emerald, as if Alexandria herself wished to remember them not in ruin, but in radiance. On the eve of Octavian's arrival, Antony held a feast. It was quiet, just a few loyal friends, a flicker of music, a table lit with low lanterns and copper bowls of honeyed bread. Cleopatra wore white. Antony poured the wine himself. No speeches, no toasts. Just eyes meeting across flickering light. and 1,000 unspoken goodbyes. When night fell, the city held its breath, the harbour braced, the stars dimmed. And inside the palace, where once laughter had echoed through moonlit halls, there remained only silence and the two souls who had dared to believe that love could be stronger than empire. The day began without colour. Even the sun, usually gold and merciless above the desert, rose behind a veil of pale clouds, its light muted, almost ashamed. The streets of Alexandria, once rich with perfume and debate and sandals scraping polished stone, had fallen quiet, eerie, reverent, a city in mourning before death had even arrived. News arrived not by trumpet but by whisper. Octavian had entered the city. His ships filled the harbour like a black tide. His banners flew not with pride but with finality, and with each step his legions took, something in the city withdrew a memory, a flame, a name. Antony, hidden in a side wing of the palace, stood before a shallow bowl of polished bronze, not for vanity but for memory. He saw his reflection and did not recognize the man in the glass. He looked tired. Not from battle, but from love. Word reached him Cleopatra was dead. The lie struck with the cruelty of precision. He did not question it, he did not pause. He asked for a sword. His most trusted servant Eros handed it to him with trembling hands, but Eros could not do what Antony asked. He could not lift the blade, could not guide it into the heart of a man who had once been the shadow of Caesar himself. So Antony did it himself. Not with rage, not with spectacle. He pressed the tip of the sword to his abdomen, breathed in, and fell upon it. But death, as always, was not clean. The blade struck, but did not kill. He collapsed, blood pouring from him in thick, wet silence. His breath faltered, eyes wide, not with pain, but with regret. Not yet, not like this. Then came the second whisper. Cleopatra lived. He gasped, alive. They carried him, his body half broken, his blood staining the stone corridors through secret tunnels, winding past frescoes of gods and lovers and the carved history of kings. The scent of myrrh thickened with every step, until finally they reached her. Cleopatra. She stood draped in mourning robes, her eyes hollow, ringed in black coal that had smeared from hours of tears. The sight of him broken, bleeding, still breathing tore something inside her that no Roman would ever understand. They laid him at her feet. She knelt. Her hands, once soft with oils and scrolls and royal ease, pressed to his wound, trembling. I came back, he whispered, voice rasping like wind through reeds. I followed you. And I was waiting, she replied, her voice caught between prayer and sob. He looked at her through fading light. Don't be afraid. I'm not, she said, not if you are here. Antony tried to lift his hand. She took it in both of hers, kissed the fingers, curled her cheek into his palm as though it still held strength. His thumb moved, just slightly, against her skin. I tried to build us a world, he said. She smiled through tears. You did, and we lived in it, even if only for a little while. His eyes began to close. I will follow you, she whispered, soon. But before he could answer, the breath left his lips. Not with violence, but like a candle fading in its own warmth. The silence afterward was unbearable. Cleopatra did not scream. She simply held him, rocked him, and let the world collapse quietly around them. Octavian sent word he wished to see her, to speak, to negotiate, but Cleopatra knew what negotiations meant to men who wore laurels and smiled without warmth. She refused food, refused comfort. Her attendants, fearing for her life, removed all sharp objects. They watched her with the vigilance of priests guarding a sacred flame. Still, she found a way. In the cool chamber where she had once slept beside Antony, where their laughter had once stirred the very dust, she summoned her final symbols. A basket of figs, and beneath the figs, a snake. An asp, the emblem of the goddess. To some, it was vanity, to others, defiance. But for Cleopatra, it was control. One final act that no emperor could steal. She dressed herself in royal linen, the colour of alabaster, crowned her hair with a diadem, painted her lips the shade of crushed rose petals. Around her neck, she wore a single pearl Antony's gift from years ago. Then, reclining upon the gilded couch, she reached into the basket. The bite was as swift. The poison began its soft, brutal hymn beneath her skin. Her breathing slowed. The room turned warm, dim, familiar. And she thought of him, his arms around her in the quiet hours, the taste of wine shared between smiles, the night he named a star after her. She thought of the barge, the Nile, the gardens where their laughter once echoed like eternity. She closed her eyes, not in fear, but in return. When her attendants found her, she looked not dead but asleep. Peaceful, whole, a queen even in death, and thus ended the lives of two souls who dared to shape the world not through war, but through love, a love too wild for marble, too soft for empire, too enduring for oblivion. Time did not stop for them. Octavian entered Alexandria like a shadow drawn long over broken light. He stood in the halls where Cleopatra had once walked in silk, where Antony had laughed among poets and generals, where children's footsteps had echoed with innocence, and in those quiet chambers emptied of breath, of life, of defiance, he saw not victory, but Silum. They were gone. Not taken by swords, not by decree, but by their own choosing. Cleopatra and Antony had robbed him of spectacle. No golden chariots, no paraded captives, no royal grovelling before Rome, only a legend left in their place. Still, Octavian ordered the tomb be sealed, their bodies placed together in death, arms touching, as if asleep between the folds of myth. He ordered the children taken, some to be raised in Rome, others to disappear into the hush of history. He stood before their bodies one final time. Perhaps he wondered how two lovers, armed only with longing, had so nearly undone an empire. History would not forget them, but it would change them. Rome would paint Cleopatra as a temptress, Antony as a fool. Plays would be written with poison-laced lines, statues would be sculpted, always with Cleopatra gazing sideways, as if hiding some fatal deceit, but beneath the propaganda, beneath the polished lies, the truth lingered in shadows. They had chosen each other. Over empire, over reason, over survival. And in that choice, they'd carved something eternal. Centuries passed. The palace fell into ruin, the harbour shifted, the obelisks weathered in the sun, but the story endured. In candle-lit rooms, lovers whispered their names. In pages inked by trembling hands, poets mourned them. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. Their tomb was never found. It remains lost beneath sand and sea, somewhere near the Nile's mouth, where reeds still whisper and the moonlight paints silver over ancient stones. Some say their spirits roam the shores at dusk, hand in hand, drawn by the scent of lotus and the sound of distant flutes. Others say they became stars, twin constellations who rise only for those who still believe in impossible love. And somewhere, perhaps not in this world, but in one made only of light, they still walk beside each other, without war, without fear. Only the hush of Lynn, only the taste of pomegranates, only the warmth of a hand never let go. So if you find yourself alone beneath a quiet ski, and you hear the sea murmur like a voice once known pause, listen. They are still there. In every love that defies reason, in every goodbye that tastes like forever, in every kiss that dares to challenge the gods. For some stories do not end. They become the breath between pages, the silence between stars, the final whisper before sleep. She was not his ruin, she was his reason.